Hey, Strong Ones. Today we have Danny Johnson with us. She is the co-founder of Sweaty Betty, which is an online health and fitness platform. That's how she started with her entrepreneurial journey. Now she is a public speaker, and she talks a lot about owning your story and rewriting your story, which I'm so excited to learn more about, because Danny, that is how I found you. I found you back in the days of Periscope.
Oh, yay.
Yeah.
Gosh, I love Periscope. Rest in peace.
Yeah, right? It was a fun platform while it lasted.
It was.
Yeah.
It really was.
But you shared a lot on that about, well, at least when I started following you, you shared a lot on your story of the decision of having your child when you're a teenager versus aborting. Can you dive in and share what that experience was and what kind of changed you to keep the child during that time in your life?
Yeah, we'll go right into it. Honestly, I was 15 years old, found out that I was pregnant. And what had happened right before is I was living at home. I was really struggling with my parents' family life. There was just a lot going on. And I became really suicidal. I actually went through a massive depression, I think, when I was around 13. I started making myself throw up. I was bulimic. I was a gymnast, and our coaches would weigh us. And there was just a lot going on. And so my self-worth was down the drain. And quite frankly, I was suicidal. I had held a gun to my head.
Oh my goodness.
I had a boyfriend at the time, and I was telling him just one day, I'm like, I can't do this anymore. And he really urged me to go to this behavioral health center. He had been in one maybe a year or two before, like kind of a rehab kind of place. And he told me to go. And so because he was begging me and I respected him, I asked my mom to take me, and she was like, you're not going to one of those places. You're not crazy. And I was basically like, if you don't take me, then I'm going to kill myself. And so she took me begrudgingly, and she kind of thought, well, they're going to talk to you and send you home. So like, let's just get this over with. And after I spoke with the staff, they told my mom, like, she has to stay with us. And so they put me on this high suicide watch. Mm-hmm. And basically I wasn't able to even go to the bathroom by myself. I had to have somebody with me 24 hours a day. And while I did the intake, they do lots of blood work, and, you know, they get a lot of kids on drugs. So they do drug tests and, unbeknownst to me, pregnancy tests. And I hadn't even considered the possibility that I was pregnant. I wasn't late yet. And so the second day I was in, my psychiatrist came and sat me down just to kind of go over paperwork and intake stuff. And he just goes, so your pregnancy test came back positive. And without any hesitation, I just said, well, I'm going to have an abortion, because I felt like I'm going to kill myself anyway. So why, like, what's the point of this? Right.
Yeah.
And I just had I didn't have any sense of, I didn't have any sense of like respect for life. I hate to say it that way, but it really was the truth. I just didn't feel like there was any reason for me to be alive. And I was raised in a very religious household, and where basically we kind of believe that like sex before marriage, that's like next to murder as far as sins go. And so I figured I was going to hell anyway, so I might as well just do all the things, right? So if I have nothing else going for me, I'm going to hell for all the things I've already done. Like, what's one more thing off of the list? Mm-hmm. So it really didn't occur to me as like I don't know. It was just like one of those things. It was like, one more thing. Okay, great. Like, this is where I'm going, and this is my life now. I've made all these bad decisions, and these are my consequences. And so I really had stuck to that plan. I called my boyfriend and I told him that I was pregnant, and he just said, oh, you're having an abortion, right? And I said, yeah. And in Las Vegas, where I lived, you didn't need parental consent. I think you only had to be 15. And so I had planned that when I got out, I would do it as soon as possible, because in my mind, if I did it before like a certain time, like maybe 12 weeks, then it wasn't, quote, a baby yet. And that was somehow like made it okay too. And so I had planned to do it, and I had an appointment, and I had money from friends borrowed and a ride to go. And I got out of the clinic, and the day before my abortion was scheduled, I was supposed to meet with an eating disorder specialist. There was like an inpatient eating disorder clinic that my parents wanted to send me to. And so my parents went to meet with the psychiatrist and the doctors and the staff, and they sent me to another room to talk with this other woman who I guess worked there. And so I was kind of, arms crossed, like, why do I have to talk to this stupid lady? And within a short amount of time, she shared with me her story about how she had been sexually assaulted by her family members, and that she had 2 children, but she was unable to have kids anymore because of her anorexia. She could no longer have kids. And out of nowhere, just out of my mouth, I said, I want you to have my baby. And I remember, like, the back of my head, it was like there was 2 people in my body at that time. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I just met this woman.
Yeah.
And she goes, what? And I said, I want you to have my baby. And I'm going, oh my God, but like, what are you saying right now? Mm-hmm. And so she goes, are you serious? And I said, yes. And so I just remember thinking, like, what are you talking about? You can't do this. You're not going to be like, I have an eating disorder. I'm going to get fat. Like, I can't handle this. I mean, there's like these crazy thoughts going on in my mind at this time. And yet it came out, and I felt like this was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So I left, and I remember calling my boyfriend, and I was like, so I told this woman that I want to give her our baby. And he's just like, okay. And it literally was in that instant, it was not a thought out decision. It was just like this compulsive something that came out of my mouth.
Yeah.
And what was crazy was I was about 20 weeks, 4 months-ish. We had just found out that I was having a little girl, and this woman called me crying, and she said, we can't adopt your baby because it's going to be a private adoption. It's going to cost $50,000, and we just don't have the money. And so now I'm like way too far past any kind of abortion. And now I don't know what I'm going to do. And my home life is not getting any better. So I was thinking, there's no way I want to bring in a child to this circumstance. And so I was really at a loss. And, there was a whole lot of things going on with that too, because of my eating disorder. It was hard to like see my body change as it is for people even without an eating disorder, I think.
Right.
And so I went through just, struggling through that. And then what am I going to do? Can I raise this baby by myself? And I ultimately found that it's funny, where I met that woman was at a social services office. And I remember seeing or hearing something about adoption. And so I went back there and I said, hey, listen, I cannot just have a baby and have it taken away and never know what happens to her. Like back in the day, that's how adoptions were, I think, right? Like they just whisk the baby away. You don't know what happens. And they said, well, it's not like that anymore. Like you can choose the parents, and there's ways that you can stay in semi-contact. And so after I learned that, I just had a lot of peace around it. And it ultimately was one of the most pivotal decisions of my life. But quite frankly, it wasn't out of like me being against abortion. It was really just a crazy, just instance of me just having compassion or something.
Was it almost like an out of body experience, like those conversations going on within your head as you're communicating this to that woman?
Yeah, I don't know if it was like out of body or multiple personality disorder, but it was like somebody in the back of my head screaming like, what are you talking about? And like, it's like words are coming out of my mouth, and yet I'm sitting there in the back watching this going like, shut up, shut up, shut up. So yeah, I mean, it was such a weird thing to just blurt it out that way. I mean, in the same instance that I blurted out as soon as I found out I was pregnant, I just blurted out, well, I'm having an abortion. Like it wasn't a thought. And the same thing with this woman. I just said, I want you to have my baby. And it was like, where are these words coming from? And that was, it was really crazy because it's such a big decision to just meet a perfect stranger and tell them you want them to have your baby when when you had an appointment to get rid of that baby the next day.
Crazy. Now, how has it been with you as an adult now, knowing that you have a child somewhere else that has been raised by different parents?
Yeah. It's so good now because I think things have come full circle.
Yeah.
But I remember thinking I always wanted to meet her, and I felt like 18 years was going to take forever. Because at this point, I wasn't even 18 yet, right? I had her before I was 18. So for me, even the years 16 to 18 felt like they took forever. It's so funny how time just passes so quickly now as an adult. But when you're younger, it's like, it feels like ages to turn 16 and get your car, turn 18 and graduate, right? So
Right.
I was going, I cannot meet her for 18 years, and I haven't even lived 18 years, and I just felt like it was so, so, so far away. But I had this moment of clarity when I had her that you're listening to the Nicole Walters podcast. I don't know what's happening on my phone here. Sorry about that. So I had this moment of looking at her and realizing that if she grew up and asked about me and found out that her birth mother committed suicide, that she would think it was her fault. And so I realized, like, at that moment, I could no longer make that be my path and my choice, because even through the pregnancy, I still felt like, okay, I'll have her and then I'll still kill myself. Like, there's a lot of messed up thoughts around that. But I saw her and I was like, I can't do this. And so she was this pivotal moment for me of like, I need to find something to do. As silly as that is, it was like, I just need to find something to do. I didn't have any goals of what I wanted to be when I grew up or anything like that. But I really worked so hard to try to be somebody that when she met me one day that she would be proud of. And so I just felt like those 18 years took so long. And the last two, probably same thing as for me turning 16, 18. I felt like for her turning 16, 18 felt like it took so long. And I remember her birthday so well because I realized that probably nothing would change. Like, it was her birthday, it would just pass. It didn't mean just because it's her birthday she was going to reach out to find me, and she didn't. And I was sad, but I kind of knew that was going to happen. But I just kept waiting and hoping, and I knew that at that point she was allowed to and she could, and I never wanted to like interfere in her life, but I did really want to be a part of it. And so it took about 9 months. We ended up, my family and we sent her a big like birthday box a couple months after her birthday. She moved to New York to go to college. And so we sent her a bunch of letters and just basically like, listen, we've known about you for 18 years, and we're here and we would love to meet you if you ever want that. And so we kind of left the ball in her court. And that we sent that, and it took about 6 or 7 months after we sent that package before I ended up meeting her. And that first meeting was really, it was so scary because I started reading like accounts about adoptees and how they feel, and trying to put myself in her shoes and wonder like what she was going to feel about me. And to be honest, a lot of adoptees feel very abandoned. They felt very bitter. They feel very angry about what happened. And I had this realization that maybe she would hate me for doing that. And I wanted her and hoped that she would realize that I wanted it for her best interest, because I didn't feel that being raised in the house where I was at the time was for her best or my best. And when we met, she was so amazing and grateful, and she felt like she was in the family that she was supposed to be in. And that felt really good. And it felt really validating. And all the years I questioned, like, did I do the right thing? And maybe I could have made it work, and maybe I should have kept her, and maybe I should have raised her. And there was always those questions going on. And when I got to speak with her, I knew that I made the right choice, not only for her, but for myself. And since then, that was almost 3 years ago. Since then, we've like slowly built a relationship, and it didn't happen overnight. There was like, basically I was a stranger to her. So, we met, and I've known her for 18 years. But that doesn't mean she knew me for 18 years. Like, I knew where she was. I knew she existed. But it took a little bit of time, and it's been really, really beautiful. And I've been just, for me, kind of trying to just be careful to not overstep any boundaries and really respect the pace at which she wants to communicate with me, which is hard because I wanted to just like jump in and, be your best friend and like show up and be like, hi, what have you been doing for 18 years? I want to know everything. But I had to kind of hold back the weirdness.
Going back to your upbringing with being in or coming from like a religious background.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a lot of body shame that goes into some type of like some religions that almost allows us to go down this path of suicide with the fact of this body shaming? And I don't know if this was true for you, but I know it was true for my upbringing. Like the word sex was like almost like a forbidden word. It was like worse than the fuck word, right? You know?
Yeah.
And like you never spoke of it. So with that, it just kind of ties in or tangles into this like body shaming of like it's not right to have some of these like sensations growing up or curiosities.
Oh yeah. I think, from very early age, I actually got caught masturbating when I was really young. And I remember my mom telling me that that was like wrong.
Right.
And that was like, God didn't want us doing that. And so I felt so bad about it. And I remember like constantly making pacts with myself, like I won't do this again, and then I would, and I'm like, okay, I won't do it again, and then I would ask for forgiveness, and then I would just do it again, and I'm like, I can't control myself. And then not only that is like even modesty and wearing certain things around the house. And I remember at a certain point I was maybe like 8 years old and I was wearing a bathing suit, and my mom was like, go put some clothes on because your father. And I'm just like, there was never any issues with my dad around sexuality. And it was like those thoughts kind of placed in your head of like, it's my responsibility for how another man or male sees me, right? Like it's my job to cover myself up because he can't control himself, or men can't control themselves. And so, yeah, there was a lot of shame around that. And there was a lot of issues around just talking about sex. Definitely. Like what you said, just it's like a bad word. In fact, I was just saying this the other day, I watched the whole series of Sex and the City with my best friend, Jill. And I remember when that came out, I think in high school. And I remember my mom just saying like, oh, this is such a filthy show. And it's funny because it's not all just about sex, but just because the title had the word sex in it, that it was like this horrible, shameful show that we should just never even look at. Right. And, we couldn't even see rated R movies. And it wasn't even about the violence or murdering in rated. Like you could watch violence, but sex is like, you can watch people getting murdered, but you can't watch people like maybe having sex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's crazy. And it's still, I think in society in general, there's a lot of that too. It's like violence is okay, but sex is not, which is a really interesting thing to think about.
I know. And I was just going to ask, like, why do you think that is so? I mean, sex is such a beautiful connecting point for human beings. And it's a way we reproduce. It's meant to be beautiful. Why do we have so much shame around something that's meant to be beautiful, yet incorporates violence and murder and death versus bringing life?
It's so interesting that you asked that. I've been really thinking about a lot of this a lot lately. Is I think so much of it is about control. There was a guy who, I think he was on Instagram DMs or something about marriage. And he's like, marriage is a woman's institution and women want to get married and guys don't. And I was like thinking back and I'm going, I actually doubt that's, if you find the origins of marriage, I guarantee it was a man who wanted to control women, who decided that was the way it was going to be. So he could have, I was like, there's no way a woman come up with that shit. Guys, men have been in control over cultures and societies and lands since the beginning of time. Right. So there's never been like we haven't even had a woman president. So we know that there wasn't a woman's freaking idea. So I think ultimately is that I think men are threatened by women because women are so beautiful and there's so much jealousy. And I think ultimately it comes down to, maybe not in a very specific way, but culturally and over time, it comes down to control. Control of women's bodies means they can control us and control who's touching us or seeing us. And, but yeah, I kind of think it comes down to control, and it's like so ingrained and so deep, so many generations that we can't even unravel where it like begins. And I don't even know how to unravel it at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. And I totally agree with you. I think it does come down to this concept of control. I think that has been coming up a lot with the podcast for this show, at least, of just like, are we really embracing our true power, or are we giving our power over to society and what is norm, versus really like staying true to our intuition. Now, you grew up very athletic. You had the gymnastic background. There's a lot of even body shaming with gymnastics, with like not be skinny enough or not being able to do the perfect routine. How did you manage getting out of that, or just mentally, and getting yourself back to a healthy place for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was another ingredient. It was like everything tied together, right? So like the religion tied into the gymnastics. And when I was 13, our coaches started basically weighing all the girls every Monday who were like puberty and above. So like if we were in 7th grade, they started weighing us, which sucks because that's when everybody's changing, everyone's gaining weight, everyone's getting their boobs. So I remember like some of the girls in our same level, I was high level gymnastics. Some of the girls in our same level who were like 9 and 10, they didn't have to do it like the older girls did. And so that exacerbated everything, and the eating disorder and like wearing a leotard and all of that stuff, you know, like you can see everything. And my coaches were not easy on our bodies. They were very much, they would make comments about other people. And so you're kind of like, ooh, I don't want them to make comments about me. So I got to make sure I'm, you know, skinny. So, you know, it lasted through gymnastics, through my pregnancy. And then I started doing fitness competitions. And so for a while, I thought I could control it through fitness competitions, which ultimately was just it was really just like putting a mask on the same freaking monster, right? Like it was me controlling my food, still controlling my body, still caring how I looked. In fact, probably more than anything, I was even more obsessed because I had this idea of perfection, and I kind of knew how to get there with manipulating food and manipulating my workouts until I couldn't. And what happened was I really damaged my metabolism. I damaged my hormones just through severe overtraining. And I just wrote a post about this the other day. I kind of had this fuck it moment of I gained about 30 pounds within a really short amount of time. And I had never had a problem with my weight before. I gained 30 pounds within maybe 2 months. And at the time, during that 2 months, it wasn't like I was binging. I was still working out excessively. I was eating like no carbs and probably 900 calories a day. So I was so confused as like, how am I eating hardly anything? I'm working out a ton and I'm gaining weight. Like the math doesn't work.
Right.
And so I had this fuck it moment of, well, if I'm going to get fat anyway, I might as well enjoy it. So I'm going to just eat whatever I want. I'm going to stop working out. I'm going to turn into a big fat slob. I'm going to blow up 300 pounds. My husband's going to leave me. And then I catastrophize the whole thing. And so I went through that. And ultimately what happened was, as soon as I stopped training so much, and as soon as I started eating whatever, I stopped gaining the weight. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like, who would have thought that I would stop gaining so swiftly? Because before, I mean, I would just do one thing and like overnight gain 5 pounds. Suddenly I was like eating spaghetti at night and not gaining any weight. And I was like, wait a second.
Yeah.
So it was a process. I kind of had to be stuck at that 30-pound weight gain for a while. And I watched a YouTube video of Gabrielle Bernstein. She's an author. She wrote a book called The Universe Has Your Back and Spirit Junkie. And she's beautiful and thin. And, you know, she said something about like, you have to love your body now in order to get that body, like the body you want. And I remember just thinking like, screw you, Gabby. Of course, easy for you to say, like, you're skinny. Yeah, you can love yourself now. If I look like you, I would love myself now too. And then I would calm down. And I'm just so triggered by that. And it took me a couple days where I was just like, it bothered me so much. And then I started going, maybe she's right. Maybe I do need to accept myself now. And I had to ask myself, if I never lost this weight, like if I stayed like this forever, would I be okay? And I didn't like the answer. I didn't want to have that 30 pounds on me forever. But I was going, well, what's the alternative, that I'm trying to lose 30 pounds for the rest of my life? I've seen my mom and my grandmother diet my whole life. And I'm like, I don't want to be dieting my whole life. And so I started on this path of going, okay, this is it. Like, this is my body for the rest of my life. I did this to myself. I gained 30 pounds. I'm stuck with it. I'm going to have to accept it. And it didn't start with like self-love. I think sometimes we hear like self-love thrown around, and it's hard to go from hating yourself so much and being so hypercritical to just loving yourself. Like that's a big leap, go from all the way to here. It's like, let's just inch into like, okay, I'm thankful my legs can walk. And then like, I'm grateful for, the fact that I could wake up today. Like you have to start with little baby steps of just like acceptance and gratitude before you could even get close to self-love. And that's really where it started, was going, okay, well, if this is it, and that was a question I'd ask myself, if I never looked any different than I did today, would my friends still like me? And then it was like, well, I don't know. Then I started flipping that around and like, well, if my best friend gained 30 pounds, would I hate her? And I was like, no, of course I would love her. I'd be compassionate. I wouldn't think anything different. So then I flipped it back around, like, well, why would all my friends not like me? Or why would, I started to flip all of these questions and like kind of look at it more objectively. So yeah, it was a process. It probably took a good 4 years to where I really felt that I could start trusting myself with food. I wasn't counting or measuring or weighing or doing any of that obsessive stuff anymore. And then it's ironically, just as Gabby said, like the weight started to come off, but I never tried. It just started coming off slowly, very, very slowly. I mean, it took 2 months to gain 30 pounds and it took like 3 years to lose it, but I never tried to lose it. And it was always like, I'd lose 5 pounds and then I would just plateau for a while. I'm like, cool, I'll stay here. And then I'd lose a couple pounds and then I'd stay there for a while.
Yeah.
And it ultimately became that it didn't become the goal. The goal was just to have peace. The goal was to have freedom. The goal wasn't to get to a certain number or anything like that. And now I just don't, I remember stepping on the scale like 20 times a day. I rarely get on a scale ever. Maybe if I see one at a gym, I'm like, oh, I'm curious, but sometimes I don't even want to know. I'm like, no, that's, sometimes if you're in a weird headspace, you're like, I don't even need to see that number. Like it could throw me off. I don't need to, but I just don't want to be controlled by that anymore.
Right. I so appreciate what you just said about how self-love is like this journey of like going from almost like this self-sabotage moment of beating your body to look and force it into a certain way, and this journey of taking it and what it means to actually have that self-love and compassion for yourself. You say a lot about just accepting your body for where it was at that time. Where does forgiveness come into play with that? Because I think for me, at least, that has been a really big key factor for forgiving some of those self-sabotaging actions to accept who I am right now. Where does that come into play for you?
Oh, such a good question. Nobody's really asked me that before, but I was going to write a post today about forgiveness. And it's funny because we so often always feel like forgiveness is for other people or to let other people off the hook. And I find the hardest person to forgive in general is ourselves for letting us, like sometimes we're mad at ourselves for gaining the weight in the first place. So we're beating ourselves up for that. And then we're beating ourselves up for not knowing any better. And we're beating ourselves up for all of these things. And I was beating myself up for over exercising myself into this situation. And I was beating myself up for like, oh, maybe if I didn't do like this certain thing, I wouldn't have gained that weight so fast. And like, there's so many things that I was going down this path of just constantly being mad at myself, beating myself up, nothing I could change in the past, and beating myself up wasn't making any change going forward. So that was also a process. It was really kind of in the journey of acceptance was also looking at myself with compassion and realizing I did the best I could with what I knew, and I need to just keep learning, and nothing is permanent. Nothing as much as we think it is, it's not.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of actual work, I did a lot of like writing letters to myself. I did a lot of like workshops and writing a letter of forgiveness to myself and just crying it out and writing forgiveness to myself for not just the food stuff, but for giving up my daughter, for not knowing any different back then. Like, it's interesting. A lot of the body stuff comes from all the past shit, right? So realizing that my food issues really didn't have anything to do with the food. They had a lot to do with me not feeling worthy enough, not being good enough, for beating myself up and trying to be perfect because I messed up as a teenager. So now I have to make it all right because I've gotten a second chance. And so I need to be perfect now because I already fucked up the first part of my life. So there are like so many things that I was using food to control and manipulate because I was trying to overcompensate for past mistakes and all that kind of stuff. And I really, really think that the forgiveness comes down to like, it's not just about the body stuff. It's like, what else do you need to forgive yourself for? What other decisions do you need to forgive yourself for? A lot of times we need to forgive ourselves for stuff we didn't even need to take on as a burden in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes we take on shame and guilt for things that aren't even ours. Like your parents' divorce, like you were 5 years old and you've been carrying that. It's like, that's not even your baggage to carry. And yet you've been holding it for so long. How about letting go of that little girl who thought that she caused her parents split or, you know, just as an example.
Right. So the listeners know that I grew up in a very Christian, legalistic upbringing. And with yesterday being Easter, and just kind of reviewing that story of Jesus dying on the cross and being raised again, it kind of just brought to my awareness of like, oh, I finally understand what he meant by forgive them for they do not know what they did. And it just, with what you're saying is forgiveness is forgiving what we didn't know.
Yeah.
And allowing ourselves that freedom of like, I didn't know any better, or they didn't know any better. And for really just giving not them the benefit of the doubt, but just accepting of like the journey of life. And it just sounds like that's what you're saying about forgiveness throughout your journey of like, you didn't know any better, and forgiving yourself through that. Do you have any, I know you have kind of more, is it, what upbringing do you have with the religion?
Mormon.
Mormon. Do you have any correlation with that? I'm just kind of curious. I know you're not very spiritual, but that has kind of formed you, who you are today. Where has religion either played for you in benefit or disbenefit or
it's
harm?
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because the forgiveness thing was like, so I don't know, I feel like it's maybe similar in Catholic religions, but so you like when you sin, right, you go to confession and then you are absolved of that. So for us, we were taught to ask for forgiveness from God, right? So we have to ask for forgiveness and receive that, which is really interesting because that's outside of yourself, right?
Yeah.
Somebody else is bestowing forgiveness on you when ultimately I think forgiveness really is for you and by you. And it's also a process. I don't think you just ask for forgiveness once and you're forgiven, or you forgive someone and then you're not triggered by them again. I think forgiveness, one of my old mentors, Danny Johnson, it says forgiveness is a practice. And I found that where, you know, there's like my ex-husband, we are divorced and he had an affair, and I felt like I'd forgiven him, and then something would come up and it would trigger me again. And I was like, oh, I thought I was over that by now. And I'd have to forgive him again and forgive him again. And then forgive myself for being upset about it, and forgive myself for not knowing, you know, what was going on. And so the interesting thing is that like, I couldn't ask God for forgiveness for not knowing about the affair. Cause that had nothing to do with God or anyone else. I mean, that was me, right? So it's an interesting concept with forgiveness in in religion, because it's a little bit different, where it's almost like okay, my child, you are forgiven. Like what? It's just a kind of a weird thing, because I really think forgiveness is very personal. And how you ask and how you receive it. I think when you ask for forgiveness for someone who's done you harm, or you've done them harm, let's say I hurt you and I said, I would really love it. You know, I really want to ask for forgiveness and I apologize. You don't have to forgive me. You could be like, F you. And it's ultimately like, that's not yours to bestow on me. That's for me just to kind of release it.
Yeah. And there's been many times in my life where I've had to learn that lesson of, I need to forgive before they even ask, and just let that issue go and not let it fester within me. And I love what you bring up, because I think sometimes within religion, I call it the Christian cop-out. We just kind of put it on God's hanger of like, okay, God will deal with this, versus taking responsibility of it. And I love what you just said about forgiveness is like, it's that inner work of like, we have to forgive ourselves and bring that peace within us versus asking God. I think for me at least, I think that's a combo of inviting the divine in to manifest within my being, to have that power to let go and forgive.
I would so agree. Like asking God, or however you want to define God, is like to have your heart softened in order to forgive or to be forgiven. Like it's not about bestowing that on you or like kind of, knighting you over the head, but saying, I need this. Like I need a shift in my heart. I need to be able to let it go. Please, like help me release that and let go of these feelings of resentment, or let go of these feelings of anger or pain.
Another thing that you brought up with sharing your story was this concept of trusting yourself again with food. Trust has been a big word for myself as well. What were some of the things that you allowed yourself to really step into trusting yourself with food and just who you were becoming at that time?
So with trust, it was interesting because kind of like those questions I asked myself of, if my best friend gained this weight, what would I feel about them? Would it change my relationship? I started to also look at my own body and go, okay, when did I actually start to count everything and weigh everything? And so I was going back going, okay, 5th grade, was already kind of obsessed with dieting.
Oh,
so
wow.
kind of around like 7 or 8 years old. I was like, okay, I'm looking at 7 or 8 year olds because I coached gymnastics for years. So I, could look at little girls and know what they were. So I'm like, okay, these 6, and let's just say even 6, even younger, because even 8-year-olds some of them are thinking about it. I'm like, 6-year-olds aren't looking at a bag of Doritos, reading the bag, seeing how many carbs are in there and how many fats, or they're not counting points. They're not doing any of that. And yet their bodies are functioning how they should. Their weight for the most part is managed. They're not like outside of, extremes. These aren't like chubby little kids. And for me as a 6-year-old, I was like very active and I was running around, and I would have to be stopped, like, hey, come eat your dinner, like stop playing, right? Like for kids, it's like you have to force them to stop. You have to remind them to eat. And so I was like, when did I become obsessed with this? Like constantly thinking about it. And so I had this idea that our bodies must inherently know, because if a baby 4, 5, 6-year-old, it doesn't just switch you when you turn 7 or just switch when you turn 8. There's some point that we bring that in, so that my body must actually know how to regulate itself. Because when I was a little girl, I would have to be told to sit down and eat. And so that was where the first trust came from. I was thinking, somehow inherently my body must know. Somehow my body must want to be at a certain weight. It must want to be at a certain place. I was scared that the weight my body wanted to be at was higher than I wanted to be at, but I had to trust that I would regulate myself if I just stopped trying so hard to like control it all. So again, it was kind of like you kind of have to put one thing before the other. You have to trust before it shows that you can be trusted,
right?
As easy as it is. So I kind of had to blindly go, okay, I'm going to just like eat. And I didn't trust myself, to be honest. At first I was like, I'm going to eat all this stuff and I'm going to blow up to 400 pounds. And this is what's going to happen to me because that's how it is. But it didn't. And so every time I ate something crazy and I didn't blow up, then I started to go, oh, my body actually does just want to normalize. And I would do it again. And then it was like, oh, and then I built a little more confidence, and then I built a little more trust in myself. And then soon it became where I didn't want to keep eating crap anymore, because I was almost like tempting it, right? I was like binging on stupid stuff and eating. I was like, fine, here we go. Gonna go off the deep end and be on my 600-pound life. But it was like a slow buildup, but ultimately it came down to me really going back in childhood and thinking, I wasn't always this way. Something shifted. How can I get back to that person who didn't think about food all the time?
Yeah. I love how you had to go back to your childhood to get back to almost like that innocence of that intuition of just knowing your body's going to lead you and guide you with the type and the right amount of food that you'll need to be nourished. I think that's fascinating that you or willing to go backwards to allow yourself to go forwards. Can you elaborate more about that? Because I know you talk a lot about understanding our stories, but also rewriting our stories.
Yeah. I talk about rewriting our story a lot because when I was placing my daughter for adoption, I had a social worker who told me about programming. She was like, Danny, you have been programmed. Your parents have been programmed. Everyone you know has been programmed, and you can reprogram yourself. Your brain is like a computer, and you type in code, you get something out. And so she really instilled this idea in me that I could actually choose my thoughts, because at the time when I was going through the pregnancy, everything was happening to me. My parents are bad to me. My family is shitty. School sucks. Society hates me. I'm pregnant. Everyone's looking at me. And so I was in this big victim mentality, and everything was happening to me, and I had no control. And she instilled in me this idea that you do have control. You get to see how you perceive this, and you can also change it. And so it was a lot of work, but I realized today that we can literally shift an idea that we have overnight. We can look, and two people can look at the same thing and see two very different things in two very different circumstances, right? Like you can have, let's just say, a diagnosis of cancer, and somebody could say, well, she's a victim. She's like a victim of this. Or someone could say she's a survivor of this, right? And it's just a way we can look at, or say like a gun violence, like she's a victim of gun violence, or she's a survivor of gun violence. It is the same thing that happened, right? Somebody had gun violence, but how you look at yourself as a survivor, as a victim, really makes a big difference on how you show up in the world, on how you feel about yourself. And so I started looking at myself as not a victim of everything, but as a survivor of hard things. And so the rewriting your story around this stuff, I realized that our stories really, how we show up today really goes back to what we believed about, could have been 10, 20 years ago. And so I think it doesn't have to always go back to childhood, but often it does. Sometimes we have things showing up today, and we have to go, where did that start? Where did I get that idea to begin with? And it might have been recently, or it might have been 10, 20 years ago. It might have been a single comment that somebody made at school that stuck with you your whole life, and somehow you thought you were stupid. And now like you think like you can't write, or you think you can't memorize things. And so I think it's important to go back, and what rewriting your story really looks like is looking at it from another perspective. Like sometimes as simple as changing vocabulary, like victim to survivor, but another perspective. And I have people in workshops do this, where you write the thing that happened to you from your perspective. Like, okay, my mom picked up me and my brother, threw us in the car, drove us to California, and we left my dad on the driveway, and they got divorced. So that's like my perspective. And then you write it from the other, like another person's perspective. So then it's like writing from my dad's perspective. I was not a good father. The kids are better off without me. Because maybe my perspective as a child is my dad didn't love us enough to stay, to make it work with my mom. And yet when I start looking at it from his perspective, maybe he felt like I'm not good enough to be a father, like they're better off without me. He may have had all these feelings of inadequacy, and completely opposite. Not that he didn't love his family enough, but maybe he loved them so much that he's like, they're better off without me. They should just go.
Right.
And then also from the narrator's perspective, kind of like an overview, where you're just like, if you're watching a movie, woman takes kids, drives in car, man standing, like there's no emotions, or there's no like storytelling involved in all of it. And I think being able to see from different sides, like from each person's perspective, you start to actually question your own story that you told yourself. Like maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe it actually wasn't about me. I didn't cause my parents' divorce. Maybe my dad did care. But when we start to look from different perspectives, that's when I think you can really rewrite what your story is, and really what your story meant about you. That's really the biggest thing, is like, the story is the story, but it's what you make it mean is what's more important.
I love that. I saw you, I believe it was on an interview with Impact of Women, or Women of Impact, and you're mentioning something else that you do at your workshops of some of those like negative voices that we say in our head. I don't know if you had them write them down, but during the interview you talked about how you partnered women up and they had to like say that what they
Yeah.
said to the other person. And when I heard that, I was like, oh my good, like it was like a knife to my chest, because it was just like, I don't know if I could say that, but yet we tangle ourselves up and almost, silence ourselves so much because of those thoughts. Yet when I thought about if I could say that out loud to someone else, I don't know if I could, but yet it's something that goes so quickly in our own mind. With not having that done in person, what are some steps people can do individually to kind of silence those narratives that aren't helpful, or those self-sabotaging thoughts that kind of get stuck in our brain?
Yeah, it's such a powerful exercise, and people always cry every time because there's two things that happen. It's one, saying that to someone else's face is difficult because you realize that you would never say it to someone.
Right.
But another piece that comes out, which you don't realize until you're doing it, is when you're looking at a friend or someone that you really admire, think is beautiful, you hear what they say back and you're like, wait a second, it's kind of like, I wouldn't think you would think that too about yourself. And then you're like, it's such a fascinating thing. And so many of the women have so many of the same things. Like, we're
interesting.
all the same thing. There's, of course, different ones, but there's a lot of like, I'm so fat, and like, you're not good enough, and things like that, that come up. And so there's themes. But I think for me, as far as going back to like the reprogramming, I'm really big on affirmations. And I just did a podcast interview actually, who was like, this woman was like, doesn't believe in affirmations. And I think that, I think there's different ways to do them. And why I believe in them is, this is how I started doing it. So I would write these affirmations that, I got this download off of some website back in like 98 or something. And it had hundreds of affirmations, and I picked like maybe 200 that I felt like fit me. And I printed them out, put them on like note cards. And I used to take them to the gym. And during my cardio, I would, because like cardio is so boring, right? It's like, oh, I got 40 minutes here. I don't know what I'm going to do. So I would read each one 10 times. And then I would go through it again and again and again for the whole 40 minutes. So I was saying these things so many times, the repetition was so high. I think what happens when people think of affirmations, they have 2 or 3, they say it in the mirror when they wake up, and that's it. Like, that's not really going to do much. For me, affirmations are like learning a new language. So I took 7 years of French. And when I first learned, it was like, you are saying a sentence and then you're translating it, and then you're translating it back so then you can respond. And it's like a very slow process, and you're constantly just like, I'm trying to figure out what they just said. So then what I want to say in English, and then I got to translate it back to French, and then I have to speak it. Well, I went to France after 7 years, and I spent 4 and like the 3rd day, I remember I was ordering some food, and the waiter asked me what I wanted, and I just responded in French without doing this translation in my head. And I was like, oh, I like thought in, like, it actually just came out like I actually thought in French instead of thinking in English and translating and then translating it back. And for me, the affirmations are like that. We have these constant thoughts that are going on and on and on and on. And when you say them enough times, what you will see is at some point, instead of your automatic negative thought, one of these times, like one of the affirmations will pop up instead. And you're like, oh, that's weird. And I found that when I was doing these, this would start to happen. Like, my automatic negative thoughts started to become these affirmations instead. And I was like, oh yes. Okay, good reminder. That's what I want to be thinking, not the old thought. Right. And so for me, affirmations, if they are to be done where they work really well, have to be consistent and repetitive over and over and over and over and over until it becomes your new thought process versus the old thought patterns. Because those old thought patterns you've been doing for years, and they're deep, and they're going to come up first. But other things like hypnosis can help. I've heard of EMDR therapy. I haven't done it yet. There's a lot of different ways, but for me, for something that doesn't cost any money and something that I think is easy to do, it's easy not to do as well. But I think the affirmations can work. If you're doing cardio or going on a walk, it's a good time. Like, if you have a dedicated amount of time that you just do this on repeat. It's boring, but it works. Yeah.
It's interesting that you say that, because I'm like, I got to get back to this. I used to water ski, and so I'd have long drives up to the lake. And instead of the affirmations, I would write down Bible verses that just really spoke to me. And that's when I really found some shifts in my life. So I say that as a thank you, because I'm like, I got to get back to something that helps me rewire this, because I saw the benefit. And I think a lot of us sometimes will get into this habit of like, we see the benefit and then we're like, okay, I'm done. I don't need to do it anymore. Like,
totally.
And then we're like, wait, what? We go back to those old habits.
Yeah.
So my question is like, is the duration of the consistency different for everyone, or is it just something like a continuous practice that you still have for yourself?
I think both, right? Like we go through those times where you're like, cool, I'm good now, and you stop.
Right.
One of the things for me lately, and it just was a reminder today, I was talking to Jill, it was a gratitude. When I was married, we did 5 gratitudes every night before we went to bed. Like the 5 things we're grateful for, or like just amazing things that happened. And then once I separated, it was like, well, he's not there. So I stopped doing it. And then I was reminded maybe a year later, I'm like, you know what? It doesn't matter. He's not here. I'm just going to say it out loud for myself. And I did it for a little while, and then I got out of the habit again. And so I'm like, okay, reminder, I need to do this again when I'm feeling like, I don't know, when I'm feeling lack of abundance or scarcity or something like that. I'm going, okay, come back to the gratitude practice. So I think, yes, the consistency depends for every person, but I think human condition is that we do something and then we stop. But it doesn't mean that it's not cumulative. You know, it doesn't mean that you're starting from scratch. It doesn't mean like my brain went straight back to where I was at 13 and I'm suicidal again.
Right.
I just needed to like, okay, I had a little detour and I'm getting a little funky thoughts here. I need to get back to it. And so, yeah, like it's good. I'm glad that it reminded you, because I had a reminder today of like, get back on the gratitude practice. As far as the affirmations, some of them to me aren't as relevant anymore. Like I had my stack of cards, and now a lot of them are just like, I don't need them. I don't need those thoughts to replace any old thoughts, but there are new ones now.
Yeah.
Because new stuff comes up, right? Like as we grow, it's kind of like with training and workouts. I remember my clients would always go, is this ever going to get easier? I'm like, no, it doesn't. As soon as this gets easy, then I just make it harder for you.
Yeah.
So I think it's the same with this. Like as soon as this becomes repetitive pattern and like your mind changes, then there's something else.
Right.
So either the affirmations need to change, or maybe the strategy needs to change. So I definitely slip up too. I'm not perfect.
One thing that you mentioned, or one of the words that kind of was highlighted when you were sharing your story of the weight gain and then just your journey of that self-love and losing that weight, was this concept of trying. Like you're trying to lose this weight. And I did a short and sweet solo episode earlier of this word try versus just doing the work. For me, at least the word try almost puts a barrier versus like really owning the journey of it. Why is the word try detrimental to improving any aspect of our life?
You know, I've never thought about it. I'm not even sure, and I'm not even sure that I would necessarily agree with you that it's detrimental.
Yeah.
Because I think that it's funny, because when I'm thinking about trying to lose the weight, in my mind, it was like this effort, right? This extra effort that I am like going to the gym specifically to try and do this, and yet it wasn't working. And it's funny because if someone was to say, just lose the weight, I would have been like, fuck you, I'm trying, but it's not working, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, sometimes we do try and stuff doesn't work, even though we are doing the thing and the results are showing up. So I don't know, but to your point, try can be tricky, because we can constantly be in a state of always trying and not actually doing, right? Like we never receive the results because we're just like, well, I'm trying. Like it can be a cop out.
Yeah.
I remember one of my coaches, I kept doing front flips, and I kept landing on my butt, and she was yelling at me. She's like, just stop. And I was like, I'm trying not to. And she's like, just over rotate. And I was like, I'm trying to. And then she just like made fun of me and just landed on her butt, like on purpose. And she's like, here you go. And I remember just going, I hate you. Like because she called me out on it, but I really wasn't trying. I was making an excuse for myself to say that I was trying, so I didn't really have to make the effort. Mm-hmm. So I think ultimately it comes down to self-awareness, and are you really trying? Are you really doing the thing? Or are you just trying to make a cop out of like, well, I am trying, so, I need to be let off the hook. Like that's just a cop out. And you have to be really honest with yourself. I will never forget that, because she was like, you're not trying. And then she just did exactly what I did and landed on her ass on the ground. And I was like, oh, she just proved that I was doing this on purpose,
Yeah. It's so crazy. You mentioned about like having like certain goals with that journey. Did you have to like let those goals kind of just go and just let the goals happen when they happened? Or I know goals can be also another tricky thing of like having like a deadline of like, okay, I have to have this done, or this weight loss at this certain time. How was that for you with still like having some goals, if you had goals during that journey, but allowing the freedom to have those goals happen when they happen versus that like pressure?
Yeah, goals are so tricky. I just started dating again, and there was this guy, he said, well, what do you want to be doing? Like, what's your 5-year goal? And I was just like so triggering for me now, because I literally have no 5-year. I don't know. I think I never expected to be here. I wouldn't have thought to be in this position or where I'm at. And so sometimes I think we set these ideas, and it's good to have a direction,
right?
But I don't think we can ever really know what's best for us, for one, and two, like if that's where we even want to be in 5 years or even 1 year. I could even have said a year ago where I would be today. I think it is important to have direction, but I think it's nice to have loose goals. And it's also, when it comes down to like that particular thing with my body, I had to change my goals to other things like financial or process. I think process goals, like let's say I want to read 5 books a month. Because I know reading, let's say my business, I want to like grow my business to make 6 figures or something like that. But I know if I work on my personal development, if I go to workshops, that I will gain the knowledge to make the money. So instead of having my money be the goal, my goal is to go to a networking event a week, read 5 books a month, and go to 1 workshop every quarter. Because I know if I get the knowledge, then that's going to lead me to the financial goals. So I stopped tying things to numbers as much, tying things to timelines as much, because I found like there's this statement that says like, if you want to see God laugh, tell him your plans. And that's definitely been my life. It's like anytime I've had plans, it's like, yeah, sure. Let's see how that works out for you.
Yeah.
And yet things do work out for me, just never, ever, ever, ever how I expect or plan them. And so I don't want to say to give up plans. I know that will give some people a heart attack, but I do think there is a freedom in allowing things to happen as they should and being open to things being better than you could have planned for them. So I do like more process things like, okay, my goal is to work out 3 days this week. My goal is to read 10 pages of a book a day, instead of my goal is to lose 5 pounds this week. It's like, how about let's just have goals on activity versus outcomes.
Right.
And I learned that a lot in network marketing too, like focus on the activity, not the outcome. And when you do the activities, the outcomes will take care of themselves.
Awesome. Cool. We're about to wrap it up. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the listeners?
Man, you know what? If you guys like this kind of stuff, actually, I have a podcast called The Best Life Podcast. Yeah. And Jill Coleman, she's a good friend of mine and one of your coaches, right?
Yes.
And so we are launching something called the Happiness Diet. Actually, really, it's coming out hopefully in the next week.
Cool.
So ultimately it's just, if you know her and I, obviously we do not love dieting at all.
Right.
And so I think diet really means like, what do you consume? It's not just what you put in your mouth, but it's also what you read, what you consume all around, like these podcasts. And so the Happiness Diet is really about like looking at all of those things and working on your mindset and coming out of that victim and the victim martyr mentality and learning about boundaries and all of that stuff. So if you guys are interested in this kind of stuff, check it out. It'll be at thehappinessdiet.com, and check out the podcast because we have these kind of conversations that I love getting deep into this stuff.
Yeah. It's a good show too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. I have no other questions one question. You just mentioned martyr. Going back to kind of the religion, do you think people play this martyrism almost as a way of like being more religious?
I think so. I see it in my mom. I think it's, in some ways, it's in reality, it's just a way to not set boundaries. You get to use the excuse of like, well, I do everything for everyone. And it's like, okay, you don't have to, for me. And it's hard because I see it and I'm like, my mom will be like, well, I helped this woman today and I helped this person and I helped everybody else. And I'm like, I wouldn't do that. I like, my time is valuable.
Right.
And in some ways she looks at me and thinks I'm selfish, but I'm going, well, I might be selfish, but also, I feel that this is my life and I get to choose. And it doesn't, like, nobody gives her an award for doing all this stuff. Right. And so it does give you a way to just be like, well, look at me. I've done everything for everybody. Like I'm a saint. And it's like, are you a saint or are you just a doormat, or are you just letting everybody, take advantage of you? So ultimately it's, I think that's a big piece for women to look at, especially is just like boundaries and going like, what is that actually getting you?
Yeah. Yeah. I think boundaries has been something big that I've been learning. I met with another coach and she was saying, she goes, you're learning boundaries now, wait until you're 40. She's like, you will know who you are. She was awesome. She was talking about how like you get another download when you're 40 of like, no fuck, don't give a fuck about anything.
Right.
And your boundaries become so much more stronger when you're in your 40s.
Yeah.
So, something to look forward to.
Boom.
Yeah.
Okay. I got issues with aging. That's the next thing I got to work on.
Hey, we all have things to work on.
So that will give me something to look forward to for turning 40, because everything else terrifies me, and that's not that far away.
Well, Danny, thank you so much for being on the show. It was a blast to talk to you about your journey, your story, and how it has impacted you to who you are today as a coach. Where can people find you?
The best place is probably Instagram. I'm at DannyJ.com, DANNY like a boy, and then you spell out .com, DOTCOM. You can find me there. I'm always doing stories and I answer my DMs. And so I'm on Facebook, Danny J, LinkedIn, all those things, Danny J, but Instagram is where I hang out the most.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, and I look forward to, what is it? The Happy Diet Life?
The Happiness Diet.
The Happiness Diet. It sounds yummy. Awesome. All right, Strong Ones, thank you so much for joining with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you share it out with your family and friends and help us grow this strong community by giving a comment and a review below. Until next week, I am peacing out.